In the dusty silence of an abandoned church in Savannah, Georgia, a woman's trembling hands hover over the lid of an ancient piano. The wood is cracked, the ivory keys yellowed with age, but something compels her to look deeper. She slides her fingers along the edge of the music stand, pressing gently, until she hears it, a soft click. A hidden compartment springs open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon photographs, brittle with time, and a journal whose pages whisper secrets from another century. Her breath catches. Her name is Lorraine Hayes, and what she's about to discover will shatter everything she thought she knew about her family, her heritage, and the instrument that has stood silent for decades. This piano, covered in dust and forgotten by time, holds within it a story that spans 5 generations, 2 world wars, a cultural renaissance, and a movement that changed America forever. But how did she get here? And why does this abandoned instrument feel like it's been waiting specifically for her to understand that we need to go back? Back to 3 weeks ago, when Lorraine first heard about the demolition notice. Back to the moment she stepped through those creaking church doors. Back to when this story truly began. Lorraine Hayes had always believed in signs. At 42 years old, she'd spent 20 years teaching music in public schools before an unexpected early retirement forced her to reconsider her purpose. The burnout had been real budget cuts, overcrowded classrooms, instruments falling apart. She'd poured her heart into her students, but somewhere along the way, she'd lost her own connection to music. That changed on a gray Tuesday morning in October when she received an email from the Savannah Historical Preservation Society. The subject line read, "Bethel AME Church. Final documentation needed before demolition." Bethel AME Church. The name struck a chord in her memory, though she couldn't quite place why. The email explained that the historic black church built in 1875 and abandoned since 2005 was scheduled for demolition in 30 days. The society was conducting a final survey of the building's contents, and they needed volunteers to help document anything of historical value. Lorraine found herself driving to the address that same afternoon. The church stood on the edge of what had once been a thriving African-American neighborhood, now largely gentrified or demolished. The building itself was a skeleton of its former glory windows, boarded up, paint-peeling weeds pushing through cracks in the front steps. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate hung open, as if inviting her in. She stepped through the heavy oak doors, and the air inside embraced her like a memory. Dust particles danced in the shafts of light that pierced through gaps in the boarded windows. Pews sat in broken rows, hymnals scattered across the floor, their pages brittle and yellowed. But there at the front of the sanctuary, illuminated by a single beam of afternoon sun, stood a piano. It was a Steinway, or at least it had been once. The wood was dark mahogany, scarred and cracked, but still dignified. The keys were covered in dust so thick she could write her name in it. But what caught her attention was the brass plaque affixed to the front panel, tarnished but still legible, presented to Bethel AME Church by the Washington family, 1891. 1891. This piano was over 130 years old. Lorraine approached it slowly, reverently. She pulled out the bench-faded velvet, torn but still intact, and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Should she? Could she? The piano had been silent for so long, but something deeper than logic compelled her to press down on middle C. The note that emerged was cracked out of tune, but unmistakably alive. The sound resonated through the empty church like a ghost awakening. And in that moment, Lorraine felt it, a pull. a connection, a certainty that this piano had a story that needed to be told. She noticed something else then. Carved into the music stand, almost invisible beneath decades of grime, were initials IW, 1891. Below that fainter, still JT, 1922. And below that, TH, 1941. And more a timeline carved in wood, each set of initials marking a different era, a different hand, a different life. Who were these people? What had they witnessed? What music had they played? Lorraine pulled out her phone and began taking pictures. The plaque, the initials, the piano itself from every angle. She didn't know it yet, but this documentation would become an obsession. A journey, a revelation. Because this piano wasn't just an instrument, it was a witness. It had stood in this church through the collapse of Reconstruction, the horrors of Jim Crow, the birth of jazz, 2 world wars, the civil rights movement, and the slow decay of the community it had once served. And somehow, impossibly, it was connected to her. But she wouldn't discover that truth for another 2 weeks. First, she had to uncover the layers of history buried in dust, hidden in archives, and locked in the memories of the few who still remembered. The question that would drive her forward, that would keep her searching through sleepless nights and countless dead ends, was simple, but profound. Why did this piano feel like home? Lorraine's investigation began at the Georgia Historical Society, where she spent 3 full days in the archives, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the quiet rustle of turning pages. She was looking for anything related to Bethel AME Church, the Washington family, and the year 1891. What she found exceeded her wildest expectations. The Washington family wasn't just any family. They were pioneers. According to the records, Isaiah Washington had been born into slavery in 1840 on a rice plantation outside Savannah. When the war ended and freedom came, he was 25 years old, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a skill set that would change his life. He was a master carpenter. By 1875, Isaiah had established himself as one of the most sought-after craftsmen in Savannah, building homes, churches, and furniture for both black and white clients. But unlike many freedmen who struggled in the economic chaos of Reconstruction, Isaiah prospered. He saved every penny, invested wisely, and by 1885 he owned his own workshop and employed 6 other craftsmen. But Isaiah Washington wasn't just building furniture and houses, he was building a legacy. In the early 1890s, as Reconstruction gave way to the dark rise of Jim Crow laws, Isaiah witnessed his community under siege. Black citizens were being systematically disenfranchised, terrorized, and pushed to the margins of society. Churches remained one of the few spaces where African Americans could gather, freely express themselves fully, and maintain their dignity. Isaiah had a vision. He wanted to give his community something beautiful, something that spoke of culture and refinement, something that declared, against all the violence and degradation surrounding them, we are here, we are human, we are worthy. In 1891, at the age of 51, Isaiah Washington purchased a brand new Steinway grand piano from a dealer in New York, an extraordinary expense that represented years of savings. The piano arrived in Savannah by ship, was transported by wagon to Bethel AME Church, and was unveiled on Easter Sunday, April 12, 1891. Lorraine found a newspaper clipping from the Savannah Tribune, a black newspaper of the era describing the event. The article was yellowed and fragile, but the words were clear. The unveiling of the Washington piano at Bethel AME Church drew a congregation of over 300 souls. when Mrs. Abigail Washington, wife of the benefactor, played the opening notes of "Lift Every Voice and Sing," many were moved to tears. This instrument represents not merely musical advancement, but the triumph of the human spirit over bondage and oppression. Lorraine sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. She could picture it, the church packed with people, many of them former slaves or children of slaves, hearing the rich, pure tones of a concert-quality piano for the first time. The music wasn't just sound. It was proof. Proof that they had survived. Proof that they could create beauty. Proof that they were building something that would last. Isaiah had the piano engraved with a plaque and carved his initials into the music stand. The piano became the centerpiece of church life. Children were taught to play. Sunday services featured hymns accompanied by the instrument's majestic sound. Community gatherings, weddings, funerals, the piano was present for all of it. But Isaiah's gift had an even deeper purpose. He'd made arrangements with the church that every child in the congregation would be offered free piano lessons. Music literacy, he believed, was a form of resistance. It was education. It was discipline. It was a skill that could never be taken away. By 1900, Bethel AME Church had become known throughout Georgia as a center of musical excellence. Young musicians trained there went on to play in churches across the South. Some even went north to pursue careers in music. Lorraine found photographs from this era, grainy sepia-toned images that showed the church in its glory. The piano polished and pristine, surrounded by well-dressed families. Children in their Sunday best, standing proudly next to the instrument. Isaiah himself, in one photograph, dated 1903, sitting at the piano, with his hand resting on the keys, his expression solemn and dignified. She studied his face for a long time. There was strength there, and sorrow, and hope. Isaiah Washington died in 1905 at the age of 65. His obituary, which Lorraine found in the archives, described him as a pillar of the community, a man who built not just with wood and nails, but with vision and faith. But his death marked the end of an era. The optimism of early Reconstruction was giving way to something much darker. Jim Crow laws were tightening like a noose around black life in the South. Violence was escalating. The spaces where African Americans could thrive were shrinking. And the piano, that beautiful symbol of hope and culture, was about to enter a very different chapter of its story. Lorraine closed the archive files and rubbed her tired eyes. She'd been reading for 6 hours straight, and the library was about to close. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Isaiah Washington's story was just the beginning. The initials carved into the music stand told her there were more chapters to uncover. More lives, more struggles, more music. And she was determined to find them all. The next set of initials carved into the piano read J.T. 1922. Lorraine knew that between Isaiah's death in 1905 and that date lay 17 years of mystery. What had happened to the piano during that time? And who was J.T.? The answer came from an unexpected source, a 93-year-old woman named Claudette Morris, whom Lorraine tracked down through the Savannah African American Heritage Center. Claudette's grandmother had been a member of Bethel AME Church in the early 20th century, and she had stories. Oh, did she have stories? Lorraine visited Claudette in her small apartment in a senior living facility where the walls were covered with old photographs, and the air smelled of lavender and memory. Claudette's voice was thin but clear, her mind sharp as a knife. "You want to know about the piano?" Claudette said, settling into her chair. "Then you need to know about Josephine Turner." We called her Josie. According to Claudette, the years following Isaiah's death were brutal for Bethel AME Church. Jim Crow laws had transformed Savannah into a segregated nightmare. Black citizens were denied basic rights, terrorized by violence, and economically strangled. The church struggled financially. Membership declined as families fled north during the first wave of the Great Migration. By 1920, the church was on the verge of closing. The roof leaked, the pews were rotting, and the beautiful Steinway piano, though still functional, was becoming a burden. They couldn't afford to maintain it. Reluctantly, painfully, the church board decided to sell it. Enter Josephine Turner. Josie was in her late 20s in 1920, a woman of extraordinary beauty and even more extraordinary talent. She'd grown up in Savannah, the daughter of a washerwoman and a dock worker, but she had a voice that could stop time. By the age of 20, she was singing in churches at private parties, anywhere she could. But the Jim Crow South had no stages for black performers, no opportunities for someone like her to truly shine. So Josie did what many talented black artists did in that era. She created her own space. In 1921, she opened a speakeasy in the basement of a building on West Broad Street. It was illegal, of course. Prohibition was in full effect, and a black woman running a nightclub was doubly forbidden. But Josie didn't care about rules that were designed to crush her. She called her establishment the Velvet Note, and it became the heartbeat of Savannah's underground black cultural scene. When Josie heard that Bethel AME Church was selling the Steinway, she knew she had to have it. She paid cash. Nobody knew where she got the money, though rumors suggested a wealthy white benefactor, or perhaps her own clever bootlegging operation. The piano was moved under cover of darkness to the Velvet Note. "My grandmother used to sneak to that club," Claudette said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. She wasn't supposed to, of course. Respectable church-going women didn't go to speakeasies, but she said the music there was like nothing she'd ever heard. Josie would sing, and that piano, that same piano from the church, would fill the room with sound so beautiful it made you forget all the ugliness outside. The Velvet Note became legendary. Jazz musicians passing through Savannah would stop there. Local talent developed their craft in that smoky basement. And at the center of it all was Josie Turner, sitting at the Steinway, her fingers dancing across the keys, her voice soaring above the chaos of the era. But the Velvet Note wasn't just about music and moonshine. It was about resistance. In a world that told black people they were less than human, Josie's Club was a space where they were artists, intellectuals, lovers, dreamers. It was freedom, even if just for a few hours on a Saturday night. Josie carved her initials into the piano's music stand in 1922, claiming it as her own. She took care of the instrument meticulously, keeping it tuned, polished, protected. The piano that had once played hymns now played jazz, blues, ragtime, the soundtrack of black resilience and creativity. Lorraine found photographs of the Velvet Note in a collection at the Savannah College of Art and Design. The images were stunning men in sharp suits, women in flapper dresses, everyone smiling, dancing alive. And there, in several photos, was the piano with Josie seated at it, her head thrown back in laughter or concentration, her hands a blur of motion across the keys. But as with all good things in the Jim Crow South, it couldn't last. In 1929, as the Great Depression crashed down on America, Savannah's economy collapsed. The speakeasies that had thrived during Prohibition suddenly had no customers. People were starving, desperate, and jazz clubs were a luxury no one could afford. The Velvet Note closed in early 1930. Josie tried to hold on, tried to keep the music alive, but it was impossible. She sold everything she had just to survive. Everything except the piano, that she couldn't bring herself to part with. According to Claudette, Josie reached out to Bethel AME Church, which had somehow managed to reopen in a smaller building on the same site. She asked if they would take the piano back. Not as a sale, as a return. A homecoming. The church accepted. In March of 1930, the Steinway piano was moved once again, this time back to the church, where it had begun its journey nearly 4 decades earlier. Josie Turner never sang professionally again. She took a job as a seamstress and lived quietly until her death in 1952. But before the piano left the velvet note, she did one thing. She sat down at it one last time and played. No audience, no applause, just her and the instrument that had given her a voice when the world tried to silence her. Claudette leaned forward, her eyes wet with tears. My grandmother said that when Josie played that last song, you could hear the whole history of our people in it, the pain and the joy, the struggle and the triumph. She played and she cried, and then she stood up and walked away. Lorraine felt her own tears falling. This piano had already lived 2 extraordinary lives, one sacred, one profane, one in the light, one in the shadows. But both were acts of survival. Both were beautiful, and there were still more stories to uncover. The third set of initials on the piano read TH 1941. By now, Lorraine was developing a method. She searched church records, census data, death certificates, and old newspapers. She spent hours on genealogy websites, tracking down descendants, making phone calls, sending emails. And slowly, piece by piece, the story emerged. TH stood for Thomas Hayes. When Lorraine first saw the surname, her breath caught. Hayes, her last name. But that had to be a coincidence. Hayes was a common name. Lots of people were named Hayes. She pushed the thought aside and continued her research. Reverend Thomas Hayes became the pastor of Bethel AME Church in 1935, in the darkest depths of the Great Depression. The church was barely surviving. Membership was down to fewer than 50 families. The building was in disrepair, and poverty was crushing the community. But Thomas Hayes was a man of uncommon faith and determination. He'd been born in 1890 in rural Georgia, the son of sharecroppers. He'd taught himself to read using a Bible and whatever scraps of newspaper he could find. By sheer willpower and divine calling, he'd made his way to seminary in Atlanta, graduating in 1918. He'd served several small churches before being called to Bethel. When he arrived, he found a community that had been battered by history. The optimism of Reconstruction was a distant memory. The vibrancy of the Jazz Age had faded into desperation. People were hungry, hopeless, and hurting. Thomas Hayes did what he could. He organized food distributions. He helped families find work. He kept the church doors open even when there was no money for heat or light. And he used the one asset the church still possessed, the Steinway piano. Thomas himself couldn't play, but he recognized the instrument's power. He invited anyone with musical ability to come and play during services. The piano, which had been silent during the lean years, began to sing again. Hymns mostly. Amazing Grace, His eye is on the sparrow. Precious Lord, take my hand. Songs of endurance and hope. But Thomas Hayes had a secret. He had a son named Samuel, born in 1920, and that boy was gifted. By the age of 10, Samuel could play anything he heard. By 15, he was composing his own pieces. Thomas saw in his son the same spirit that Isaiah Washington had tried to nurture decades earlier: music as a form of dignity, of transcendence, of resistance. Thomas made sure Samuel practiced on that piano every single day. The boy's hands flew across the keys with a grace that left congregants in tears. Samuel's music became a lifeline for the community. People would come to church just to hear him play. Even in the midst of crushing poverty, his music reminded them that beauty still existed. In 1941, Thomas Hayes carved his initials into the piano's music stand right below Josie Turner's. It was an act of stewardship, a declaration that he would protect this instrument and the legacy it represented. But then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II, and everything changed again. Samuel Hayes was 21 years old. He enlisted in the Army in early 1942, part of the wave of young black men who served their country, despite the fact that their country refused to treat them as equals. He was assigned to an all-black unit and shipped overseas. Before he left, Samuel played one last time on the Steinway. Lorraine found a letter he'd written to his father, preserved in a box of church records that had been moved to the Georgia Historical Society. The letter was dated March 1942. Dear Father, I played our piano last night for what may be the last time. I don't know if I'll come home. So many don't. But I want you to know that every note I've ever played on that instrument has been a prayer of thanks for the life you gave me, a prayer for our people who have endured so much, a prayer that one day we'll be truly free. Keep that piano singing, Father. Even if I can't, someone else must. The music cannot die. Love, Samuel. Lorraine had to stop reading. She set the letter down and pressed her hands to her face, trying to contain the emotion rising in her chest. Samuel Hayes. Was he related to her? The name, the timeline, the location, it was too much to be coincidence. But she wasn't ready to face that possibility yet. Not until she had more proof. Samuel Hayes did come home from the war, though he was wounded in Italy in 1944 and spent months in recovery. When he returned to Savannah in 1945, he was changed. He walked with a limp, suffered from what they would now call PTSD, and rarely spoke about what he'd seen. But he could still play the piano. And he did. Every Sunday. Every funeral. Every wedding. His music became even more profound, layered with the grief and wisdom that only comes from witnessing horror. During the war years, Bethel AME Church had transformed yet again. It became a meeting place for families of black servicemen. The piano played at send-offs and homecomings, at memorial services for those who didn't return, and at celebrations for those who did. It was a witness to the community's pain and pride. Thomas Hayes died in 1950, having led Bethel through the Depression and the war. His son Samuel continued to play the piano for years afterward, though he never spoke much about his father or the instrument's history. He seemed to carry a weight that music alone couldn't fully lift. But he did one thing that would change everything. In 1948, Samuel married a woman named Grace, and together they had a daughter. They named her Eleanor. And Eleanor Hayes would become the most important person in the piano's long history. But Lorraine didn't know that yet, not until she found the next layer. The fourth set of initials carved into the piano were different from the others. They were smaller, more tentative, as if the person who made them wasn't entirely sure they had the right. They read EH, 1963, Eleanor Hayes. By this point in her research, Lorraine had developed a gnawing suspicion. The Hayes name kept appearing. The timeline was right. She was born in 1982, which meant her mother would have been born around 1960, which meant her grandmother could have been born in the late 1940s. The math was lining up in a way that made her heart race and her hands shake. But she forced herself to focus on the history first. She could deal with the personal implications later. Eleanor Hayes was born in 1948, the daughter of Samuel and Grace Hayes. She grew up in the shadow of her father's trauma and her grandfather's legacy. The church was her second home. The piano was her first language. Samuel taught Eleanor to play starting when she was 5 years old. He'd place her tiny hands on the keys and guide her fingers, teaching her scales and hymns and jazz standards. Eleanor absorbed it all like a sponge. By the time she was 10, she was playing during church services. By 15, she was writing her own compositions. But Eleanor Hayes was more than a musician. She was a revolutionary. The 1950s and 1960s were a time of seismic change in America, and nowhere was that change more urgent and dangerous than in the Jim Crow South. The civil rights movement was building momentum, and Savannah became one of its crucial battlegrounds. Bethel AME Church, under the leadership of Reverend Marcus Johnson, became a meeting place for organizers. The NAACP held strategy sessions there. CNCC volunteers trained there. And Eleanor Hayes, just a teenager, was in the thick of it. Lorraine found Eleanor's name in archives she hadn't even known existed, FBI files on civil rights activists, old newspapers reporting on protests and sit-ins, photographs from marches and rallies. In several images, Eleanor was visible a young black woman with an afro, wearing a dress, and carrying a sign, her face determined and unafraid. But Eleanor's most powerful contribution wasn't her protest sign. It was her music. Before marches, the organizers would gather at Bethel, and Eleanor would play. She'd play Spirituals We Shall Overcome, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, Keep Your Eyes on the Prize, songs that had sustained enslaved people through bondage and now sustained freedom fighters through violence and terror. Her piano playing was a weapon. It rallied the troops. It calmed the fearful. It reminded everyone why they were risking their lives. Lorraine found testimony from several people who'd participated in the Savannah civil rights campaigns. One woman, now in her 80s, remembered, before we'd go out to face the police dogs and the fire hoses, Eleanor would play. She'd sit at that old piano in Bethel. I remember, it was scarred and out of tune but still powerful, and she'd play Precious Lord, Take My Hand. And we'd sing. And somehow that music made us brave. In 1963, at the age of 15, Eleanor carved her initials into the piano. She'd just returned from the March on Washington, where she'd heard Dr. King speak. She was on fire with purpose and possibility. The piano represented her connection to her ancestors, to her community, to the struggle itself. But Eleanor's activism came at a cost. In 1964, she was arrested during a sit-in at a whites-only lunch counter. She spent 3 days in jail. Her father, Samuel, was terrified. He'd survived a war, but the thought of his daughter facing the brutality of Southern law enforcement nearly broke him. He begged her to stop, to be careful, to think of her future. But Eleanor couldn't stop. The fight was too important. The stakes were too high. Between 1963 and 1968, Eleanor Hayes participated in dozens of protests, organized voter registration drives, and used her music to inspire a generation of activists. She was admitted to Spelman College in Atlanta in 1966, where she studied music and continued her activism. But on April 4, 1968, everything changed. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. The news devastated the movement and broke hearts across the nation. Eleanor, then 20 years old, came home to Savannah for the memorial service held at Bethel AME Church. Hundreds attended. The church overflowed with grieving, angry, heartbroken people, and Eleanor Hayes sat at the Steinway piano and played. Lorraine found an audio recording of that service preserved on an old reel-to-reel tape that had been digitized by the Georgia Historical Society. She sat alone in her apartment and listened. The sound quality was poor, crackling, distant, but Eleanor's playing came through clearly. She played "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," the same song Dr. King had requested just before his death. Her playing was slow, mournful, but also somehow defiant. It said, "We are still here. We are still fighting." The music continues. But then Lorraine found something that made her entire investigation pivot on its axis. Among the church records in a box labeled "Personal Effects," Eleanor Hayes, she discovered a journal. It was a simple composition notebook, the kind students use, filled with Eleanor's handwriting, small, neat, precise. The entries dated from 1963 to 1968. Lorraine's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The journal was a revelation. Eleanor wrote about the fear she felt before protests, the exhilaration of small victories, the crushing grief of losses, the exhaustion of fighting a system designed to destroy her. And she wrote about the piano. One entry from 1965 read, "I played today for 2 hours. My fingers were on the same keys my great-grandfather Isaiah first blessed. The same keys my father played before he went to war. The same keys that sang jazz in Josie Turner's club. This piano holds all of us, all our pain and all our hope. When I play, I'm not alone. I'm part of something bigger than myself, and that gives me courage." Lorraine stopped breathing. Great-grandfather Isaiah. That meant Samuel was Eleanor's father, which meant Thomas was her grandfather, which meant Isaiah was her great-great-grandfather. And if Eleanor was connected to all of them, then… Lorraine flipped to the back of the journal where Eleanor had written a final entry dated December 1968. "I'm graduating soon. I'll be leaving Savannah. I don't know if I'll ever come back. The movement is changing. The city is changing. Everything feels uncertain. But I made a promise today. I told my mother that if I have a daughter, I'll tell her about this piano. About Isaiah and Josie and my father and grandfather. About what it means to fight for freedom. About how music can save your soul when the world tries to crush it. I pray she'll understand. I pray someone will always remember." The journal ended there. Lorraine's vision blurred with tears. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the notebook. Eleanor's mother was named Grace. Eleanor graduated from Spelman in 1970, and Eleanor had a daughter. Lorraine pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and called her mother. She hadn't spoken to her in 3 weeks. They'd had a falling out over something trivial, something that now seemed impossibly small. "Mom," Lorraine said when her mother answered. "Mom, what was Grandma's name?" "Your mother." There was a pause. "Lorraine, why are you asking me this? You know, your grandmother's name was Eleanor. Eleanor Hayes. She passed away before you were born." The world tilted. Everything came into sharp, crystalline focus. Eleanor Hayes was her grandmother, which meant Samuel was her great-grandfather, Thomas her great-great-grandfather, Isaiah her great-great-great-grandfather, and that piano, that scarred, dusty, forgotten piano sitting in an abandoned church, was her family's legacy. After the revelation about Eleanor, Lorraine spent 2 days unable to do anything but sit with the weight of what she'd discovered. Her mother, confused by the sudden interest in family history, sent her what little she knew about Eleanor. The truth was painful. Eleanor Hayes had never spoken much about her past. She'd married Lorraine's grandfather, a man named Robert Collins, in 1972. They'd had one daughter, Lorraine's mother, Patricia, in 1960. But the marriage was troubled. Robert was abusive. Eleanor left him when Patricia was 10, taking her daughter and moving to Atlanta to start over. Eleanor worked as a music teacher in Atlanta public schools for 25 years. She was a good teacher, beloved by her students, but she was also distant, haunted. She struggled with depression, with the trauma of the movement, with the weight of everything she'd seen and endured. She rarely talked about Savannah. She never mentioned the piano. It was as if she'd locked that part of her life away, too painful to revisit. Eleanor Hayes died in 1995 of cancer at the age of 47. Lorraine was 13 years old and had only met her grandmother twice. She remembered a quiet woman with sad eyes who smelled like lavender and old books. She remembered her grandmother's hands, beautiful hands, long fingers that looked like they were made for piano keys. But she'd never known her grandmother's story. Her mother hadn't known either. Eleanor had taken her secrets to the grave. Except she hadn't. Not entirely. Among the items her mother sent was a small wooden box that had belonged to Eleanor. Inside were photographs, old newspaper clippings, and a letter. The letter was addressed to my granddaughter if I'm blessed enough to have one. Lorraine opened it with shaking hands. The letter was dated 1990, 5 years before Eleanor's death. The handwriting was the same as in the journal, precise, beautiful. To my granddaughter, it began. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if Patricia will even tell you about me. I haven't been the mother she deserved, and I certainly won't be the grandmother you need. But I want you to know something. I want you to know where you come from. There's a piano in Savannah. It's in a church called Bethel AME. By the time you read this, the church might be gone. The piano might be destroyed. But if by some miracle it's still there, I need you to find it. That piano holds our family's soul. It was bought by your great-great-great-grandfather, Isaiah Washington, in 1891. It was played by Josephine Turner in a jazz club during Prohibition. It was my grandfather's sanctuary during the Depression. It was my father's salvation after the war, and it was my voice during the movement. Every note played on that piano is a prayer that we survive, a prayer that we remember, a prayer that we continue. I left Savannah because I couldn't bear to stay. The memories were too heavy. The piano reminded me of everything we'd lost, everyone we'd buried, all the battles we'd fought, and the wars we'd still have to fight. I thought leaving would free me. But it didn't. It just made me empty. If you find this letter, if you find that piano, please do what I couldn't. Bring it back to life. Let it sing again. Don't let our story die. With love, your grandmother Eleanor. Lorraine sat on her living room floor surrounded by photographs and clippings, and her grandmother's desperate hope. And she sobbed. Great heaving sobs that came from a place so deep she didn't know it existed. She finally understood. The pull she'd felt when she first saw the piano. The certainty that it was waiting for her. It wasn't mysticism. It wasn't coincidence. It was blood. It was memory. It was 5 generations calling across time, asking to be remembered. And then Lorraine remembered something else. The hidden compartment in the piano. She'd discovered it in her initial exploration, but hadn't fully examined what was inside. She'd been too focused on the external history. She drove back to the church that same day. The demolition was scheduled to begin in 1 week. She had to move fast. The church was exactly as she'd left it. silent, dusty waiting. Lorraine approached the piano with reverence and certainty. She knew now that this wasn't just an instrument. It was a tomb, a time capsule, a vessel carrying the souls of everyone who'd touched it. She carefully opened the hidden compartment. Inside, bundled together, were the items she'd glimpsed before: letters, photographs, and Eleanor's journal. But there was something else she'd missed, a small leather pouch at the very back. She pulled it out and loosened the drawstring. Inside was a collection of items, each carefully wrapped. A lock of hair tied with ribbon. A wedding ring, tarnished but beautiful. A military service medal. A pressed flower. A small brass key. And a photograph. The photograph was in remarkably good condition, protected by the leather pouch. It showed a group of people standing in front of Bethel AME Church, circa 1890. In the center was a man she recognized from the archives, Isaiah Washington. Next to him was a woman, presumably his wife, Abigail. And surrounding them were children, grandchildren, friends, community members. They were all dressed in their finest clothes, all standing proudly, all looking directly at the camera, with expressions that said, "We are here. We matter. Remember us." Lorraine turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Washington Family and Bethel Community, Easter Sunday, 1891. The day the piano came home." She pressed the photograph to her chest and let the tears come. These were her people. This was her family. Isaiah Washington wasn't just a historical figure. He was her great-great-great-grandfather. His blood ran in her veins. His determination lived in her heart. She set the photograph aside and examined the letters. Most were correspondence between Samuel and his wife Grace, between Thomas and various church members, between Eleanor and her mother. But one letter was different. It was addressed to the future and dated 1968. Lorraine recognized Eleanor's handwriting immediately. She unfolded the brittle paper and read, "To whoever finds this, to whoever cares enough to look. This piano is more than wood and wire and ivory. It's a witness. It witnessed my great-grandfather's hope when hope was forbidden. It witnessed Josephine Turner's defiance when defiance could get you killed. It witnessed my grandfather's faith when faith was all we had. It witnessed my father's grief when grief was the only honest emotion. And it witnessed my fight for freedom when freedom seemed impossible. I'm leaving this letter here because I'm afraid. I'm afraid that when I leave Savannah, I'll forget. I'm afraid that my daughter won't understand. I'm afraid that this piano, this beautiful, scarred, sacred thing will be forgotten, like so much of our history has been forgotten. But if you're reading this, it means someone remembered. It means someone cared enough to look deeper. It means the story continues. The piano's music isn't just notes and rhythms. It's the sound of survival. It's the sound of a people who refused to be erased, no matter how hard the world tried to erase them. If you can save this piano, let it play again. Let it tell its story. Because every key that's pressed is a connection to the past. And every song that's played is a promise to the future. With hope, Lorraine Hayes, December 1968. Lorraine finished reading and looked at the piano through new eyes. She could see it now not as a forgotten relic, but as a living monument. She could feel the presence of everyone who'd ever touched these keys. Isaiah's strong carpenter's hands, Josie's quick dancing fingers, Samuel's trembling touch after the war, Eleanor's powerful defiant playing during the movement, and now her own hands, the latest in a long line carrying the weight and the privilege of legacy. She sat down at the bench, placed her fingers on the keys, and played. The notes were out of tune, cracked, broken, but they still sang. She played "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," the same song Eleanor had played at Dr. King's memorial, the same song Samuel had played when he came home from war, the same song that had echoed through this church for over a century. As she played, she felt them all around her. Isaiah, Josie, Thomas, Samuel, Eleanor. 5 generations of struggle and strength and survival. All of it flowing through her hands, through the keys, through the air. She finished playing and sat in silence. The church seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for someone to complete the story. Lorraine knew what she had to do. This piano would not be demolished. This story would not end here. She would save it. She would restore it. She would make sure the world knew what it represented. Because this wasn't just her family's history. It was American history. Black history. Human history. It was a testament to resilience, creativity, and the refusal to be silenced, and she was the only one left who could tell it. The next 6 months were a whirlwind. Lorraine launched a crowdfunding campaign to save the piano. She created a website documenting the entire history: Isaiah, Josie Thomas, Samuel, Eleanor, and the instrument that connected them all. She gave interviews to local news stations. She contacted the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The response was overwhelming. People from across the country donated. Descendants of other Bethel AME church members came forward with their own stories and photographs. Historians reached out offering to help document everything. Musicians volunteered to perform fundraising concerts. Within 3 months, Lorraine had raised enough money not only to save the piano, but to restore it professionally and to purchase the church building from the city. Bethel AME Church, which had been slated for demolition, was instead designated a historic landmark. A master piano restoration specialist from New York, a black man named Robert Williams, who specialized in historic instruments, agreed to take on the project. He spent 2 months carefully disassembling the Steinway, cleaning each piece, replacing broken parts, restringing, retuning, restoring the wood and ivory to its former glory. But he also made sure to preserve the history. The carved initials remained. The brass plaque stayed in place. The hidden compartment was maintained. Every scar, every mark, every sign of age was honored as part of the story. During the restoration process, Robert discovered something remarkable. Inside the piano's soundboard, dozens of names were written in pencil names of everyone who'd ever played it, spanning over a century. Isaiah Washington, 1891. Abigail Washington, 1892. Hundreds more. Names that had never been famous, never made history books, but who'd been part of the music nonetheless. "This is extraordinary," Robert told Lorraine. "I've restored hundreds of pianos, but I've never seen anything like this. This instrument is a living document. It's proof that ordinary people make history every day, even if nobody remembers their names." When the restoration was complete, Lorraine organized a grand reopening event. They held it at Bethel AME Church, which had been partially renovated to host the piano safely. Over 300 people attended, descendants of the original congregation, civil rights veterans, musicians, historians, and community members. Lorraine stood before the crowd, her mother Patricia beside her, both of them wearing dresses that had belonged to Eleanor. Lorraine had found them in her mother's attic, carefully preserved in garment bags. This piano, Lorraine began her voice strong, despite her nerves, is more than an instrument. It's a witness to over 130 years of Black life in America. It witnessed the hope of Reconstruction. It witnessed the terror of Jim Crow. It witnessed the creativity of the Jazz Age. It witnessed the sacrifice of World War II. It witnessed the courage of the Civil Rights Movement. And it witnessed the slow decay of communities neglected and forgotten. But it also witnessed love, and faith, and music, and the unbreakable determination of people who refused to let their story die. My great-great-great-grandfather Isaiah Washington bought this piano in 1891 to give his community something beautiful. He wanted to declare to a hostile world that Black people were cultured, talented, worthy, that we mattered. And we do. We always have. This piano proves it. The crowd erupted in applause. Lorraine sat down at the restored Steinway, her heart pounding. The keys gleamed. The wood shone. Everything was perfect. She played Lift Every Voice and Sing, the same song Abigail Washington had played on Easter Sunday, 1891. The same song that had been sung at civil rights marches. The same song that had been called the Black National Anthem. The piano's voice was glorious, rich, pure, powerful. Every note resonated through the church like a benediction. And as Lorraine played, she could feel them all there, with her: Isaiah, Josie, Thomas, Samuel, Eleanor. 5 generations united in music. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People embraced, cried, celebrated. The piano had come home. The story had been told. The music continued. After the ceremony, a museum curator from the Smithsonian approached Lorraine. "We'd like to feature this piano in our permanent collection," she said. "It's one of the most significant artifacts we've encountered. It tells the story of Black America in a way that few objects can." Lorraine shook her head. "Thank you, but no. This piano belongs here in Savannah, in this church where its story happened. People need to be able to come here and touch it and play it. And remember, it can't be behind glass. It has to stay alive." The curator smiled. "I understand. Then let's make sure this church is preserved and that people know about it. This is too important to be hidden." They agreed to work together to turn Bethel AME Church into a cultural center and museum with the piano as the centerpiece. Music lessons would be offered to children just as Isaiah had intended. Concerts would be held. History would be taught. The piano would continue to do what it had always done: connect people across time, across struggle, across generations. 6 months after the reopening, Lorraine stood alone in the church on a quiet Tuesday evening. The sun was setting, casting golden light through the windows. The piano sat in its place of honor, polished and proud. She sat down at the bench and ran her fingers across the keys, not playing yet, just feeling. She thought about Isaiah, working for years to afford this instrument. She thought about Josie playing jazz in a basement club, claiming her right to create. She thought about Thomas and Samuel using music to survive darkness. She thought about Eleanor playing anthems of freedom while the world tried to break her. And she thought about herself, the latest link in a chain that stretched back over a century. "Thank you," she whispered to the piano, to her ancestors, to the music itself. "Thank you for not letting me forget. Thank you for bringing me home." She played a simple melody, one Eleanor had composed, which Lorraine had found written in the back of the journal. It was gentle, hopeful, tinged with sadness. but ultimately triumphant. As the last notes faded, Lorraine realized something profound. Every forgotten object holds stories waiting to be heard. Every abandoned building holds ghosts waiting to be honored. Every family has a history waiting to be uncovered. We just have to care enough to look, to listen, to remember. Because in the end, music, like memory, like love, like legacy, never truly dies. It just waits, patient and eternal, for someone to come along and set it free once more. The piano's keys glowed in the fading light. Lorraine stood, placed her hand on the wood one last time, and smiled. The story was told, the music continued. And somewhere across time and space, Isaiah Washington, Josephine Turner, Thomas Hayes, Samuel Hayes, and Eleanor Hayes were smiling too, because their piano, their witness, their voice had finally found its way home, and it would never be forgotten again.